In this lesson, we're going to be learning about simplifying fractions. First of all, let's review. A fraction is made up of a numerator and a denominator, and they are separated by a fraction bar. The fraction bar is actually representing an operation. The operation it's representing is a division symbol, and it actually signifies that the numerator is being divided by the denominator. In a fraction, we identify the numerator because we look at the number of pieces that are shaded in, and in this case we have 8 pieces that are shaded in, so our numerator would be 8, and our denominator is represented by the number of pieces total. So here we have 5 columns of 4, so our denominator would be 20. If we add in another fraction here, we're going to look and compare these two pictures. So you can see that the purple area that is shaded in is the same size in both fractions. However, in this fraction, we have 8 pieces and there are a total of 20 pieces. However, in this fraction, we have 4 pieces that are shaded in and there are a total of 10 pieces. However, these two fractions represent the same amount. We're just using different numbers to represent them. Now let's add in a third fraction. So here again we have our original fraction with 8 pieces out of 20 being shaded in. Here again we have our 4 pieces out of 10 that are shaded in. And now down here we have a very similar fraction representing the same amount that is shaded in. However, now we have 2 pieces out of a total of 5. Now, because all of these fractions are representing the same amount, we can call them equivalent fractions. Now let's take a look at equivalent fractions on a number line. Here I have a number line that's broken down into 8 equal sections, and each section represents 1/8. Here I have 1/8 shaded in, and when I fill in 2 sections, now I have 2/8 shaded in. Watch what happens when I change this, and instead of breaking it down into 8ths, I only break it down into 4 sections. My 4ths are now represented by the purple lines. And so although I am shading in the same amount, notice that my 2/8 now changes into 1/4. Watch what happens when I make it a little bigger. So instead of looking at 2/8, I'm now looking at 4/8. Well, instead of breaking it down into 8ths like the pink is doing, I'm going to break it down into 4ths. And the same amount here that is shaded in would be 4/8 if it were broken into 8ths, but now that I only have it broken down into 4ths, it is representing 2/4. And now if I even take it one step closer and break it down into halves represented by these green lines, so here I would have 1/2 and 2/2, the same amount of space that was representing 4/8 before and 2/4 when I broke it into 4ths is now representing 1/2. Again, all of these fractions that are representing the same amount are called equivalent fractions. Our goal when trying to simplify fractions is to go from the one using the largest number and go directly to the fraction that is using the smaller numbers. This would be our simplified form. Now how do we go from 4/8 directly down to 1/2? Well, in order to do that, we have to find the greatest common factor of both the numerator and the denominator. So in order to do that, I'm going to write both of my numbers, both my numerator and my denominator, next to each other. And I'm going to identify the factor pairs for each. So I'm going to start with the 4. So I would start with the first factor pair of 4, and I know that 1 times 4 equals 4. Now I can move on to what comes after 1. We would start with 2, and 2 can go into 4 2 times. Now I have no more in between 2 and 2, so I am done finding the factors of 4. Now I'm going to move over to 8. So the first factor pair for 8, every number has a factor of 1 multiplied by itself. It is also an even number, so I know it can be divided evenly by 2, and it's 2 times 4 in order to get to 8. Now the number in between 2 and 4 is 3, but there's nothing I can multiply 3 by to get to 8, so again I am finished. Now the important thing is I want to identify the greatest common factor of these two numbers. So if I were to list out the factors of 4, I would list 1, 2, and 4. And if I were to list out the factors of 8, I would list 1, 2, 4, and 8. And if I look at these two lists, I can see that the greatest factor that they have in common is the 4. Now, what do I do with the greatest common factor now that I have identified it as 4? All I'm going to do is I am going to divide both my numerator and my denominator by the greatest common factor. And if I have actually found the greatest common factor, I am going to go directly from my 4/8 to my simplified form, which is 1/2. Now, in order to know that I am for certain found the simplified form, I have to look at my numerator and denominator. And if the only factor that they now have in common is a 1, then I know that this is the simplified form. However, if I find that there is another factor they have in common, then I can simplify it even further. Let's try another one. Here we have the fraction 12/15. So again, we're going to find the greatest common factor, or the GCF, between 12 and 15. So I'm going to list out the factors for each below. And if I start with 12, the first factor pair I would have is 1 and 12. And then it's an even number, so it is divisible by 2. So I would be able to divide 2 into 12 6 times. It does have a factor of 3 and 4, and since there is nothing between 3 and 4, I know I am finished. Now looking at 15, the first factor pair would be 1 and 15. Then it is an odd number, so it is not divisible by 2, but it is divisible by 3, because 3 times 5 is 15. 3 times 5 is 15. And the only number between 3 and 5 is 4. 4 does not go into 15 evenly. So I am finished. Now looking at my two sets, I want to make sure that I'm going in order, and then I want to start at the largest factor so I can make sure that I am finding the largest factor that they have in common. And as I go through these two numbers, I can see that the largest number they have in common is 3. So if I take that 3, the greatest common factor, which is now 3, I can divide my numerator and my denominator by the greatest common factor, and I will get my simplified form. Now, because I'm looking at 4/5, I can see that 4 and 5 only share the common factor of 1, so I know that this is my simplified form. I want to caution you about the importance of finding all of the factors. So if I'm looking at this problem, 15/60, I'm going to list all of the factor pairs. For 15, it was pretty easy because there are only 4 factors, 1, 3, 5, and 15. But for 60, I have a whole bunch of factor pairs. However, I conveniently left one out here in the middle. And if I were to just look at these two sets of factor pairs, I would think that, looking at the two of them, that the only one they have in common, or the greatest one they have in common, would be 5. So if I were to take that number back and divide my numerator and my denominator by 5, I would think that my answer was 3/12. And if I wasn't looking very carefully, I might not notice that 3 is actually a factor of 12. So I could simplify this even further by dividing 3 and 12 by 3. And that would actually give me my simplified form of 1/4. If you haven't figured out already, the missing factor pair was 4 and 15. So if I were to then divide my numerator and denominator by the new common factor of 15, then I would go directly to my simplified form of 1/4. One last little trick I would like to show you is once you've identified the greatest common factor and circled it, there is a little trick to finding the new fraction. So instead of going through all of these pieces of actually dividing the numerator and denominator by 15, there is a little trick that you can do that if you look directly across from the partner, your greatest common factor, you actually will find your new fraction. So the new fraction would be 1 from the 1, and your denominator would be 4th from the 4th. Now let's try one on your own. Pause the video and see if you can simplify this fraction by finding the greatest common factor. Hopefully you've solved the problem because we're about to show the answer. And as you can see, the greatest common factor between 6 and 24 is in fact 6. So if I were to divide numerator and denominator by 6, I would get my answer of 1/4 again. And if you use our little trick, looking directly across from the greatest common factor, you would find that our answer is, again, 1/4. Let's try one last problem. Go ahead and pause the video and simplify this fraction by finding the greatest common factor. Okay, the answer is coming right now. The greatest common factor between 12 and 42 is 6, so if I divide my numerator and my denominator by 6, I will get my simplified fraction of 2/7. And again, if I look directly opposite from my greatest common factor, I will find my fraction 2/7. Thank you for watching, and I hope you learned a lot about simplifying fractions.